not a frog expert from the Amazon, but thank you. I think, again, to go back to Leon's allusion to what are the criteria behind picking IBAT data, one of them is that they are coming from national sources. They're compiled nationally using global criteria. And so I think information like important bird areas is eminently prepared to support that need. So if you are going to Brazil, there will be an NGO who worked on the ground to map those species and those sites, which you can talk to. So there's a potential there to at least that first door open to, okay, who created that data information? They will have networks that can probably get to the frog expert in the Amazon. So there's a potential there. And again, that builds on the strength of groups like BirdLife who have got these huge networks. IUCN's process expert networks of, what is it, 10,000 people around the world. Again, this huge expert network is there generating information. So again, I think the potential lies there. Is how we put that into IBAT, and a challenge for Martin there to operationalize that.
Conrad, one more comment on that, and that's what the Deeplinks provide in IBAT. So when I click on a site, a key biodiversity area might appear. I see the list of species in the key biodiversity area. One of them is endangered. It sends me to, there's a deep link on one particular endangered site. I go to the red list, and now I read all the species specialists on that one particular site. Really, in a couple of projects, when IFC is dealing in areas of very high biodiversity value, we do want sometimes the world's leading expert on that species. So and actually have consulted with them. Thanks to be able to, thanks to the citations in the red list that are connected to that. Indirect. But, yeah.
A number of comments to respond to some of those from the floor. I realise perhaps we could have structured this session more with a nice critique of IBAT as well, and I'm just going to mention some of these so that some people can respond. We often hear from clients that for example, Nigeria, there are lots of IUCN Category 1 to 4 protected areas which are forest reserves. You'd be aware forest reserves or forest class A's in Francophone Africa were mainly put in place in the 1950s. Certainly Nigeria, Republic of Guinea, about 85% of them entirely deforested. So there are these sites which are designated as IUCN protected areas which are actually just wasteland now. And it's frustrating for clients to go into IBAT and find, oh no, we're putting a road through this area. In fact, on the ground, there isn't actually anything there. So that's the difference between the site, it's recognized as a site, but in fact, sometimes there is little biodiversity value in the site at all. There's a number of those kind of critiques that come out. We had some interesting suggestions. Credit Suisse suggested about, Credit Suisse still here, yes, about media attention. So that is something I think that could be done for individual countries or regions like the Arctic, etc. Rio Tinto has recently restructured its risk assessment. We've been working with them to split it up into biodiversity risk, compliance risk, and reputational risk, because they are often quite distinct things. And one way that we're doing it is ranking countries or regions by conservation maturity. So a country or region of high conservation maturity is one where there's lots of data, there tends to be lots of attention, NGOs are well developed, etc. And in that kind of region or country, it presents a risk in terms of reputational risk, because even small impacts will have high attention, but it also is a risk because and inversely, we have low conservation maturities, so that's a country, say, much of sub-Saharan Africa, where there isn't much data. It also points out that there are risks because the data, you might be having impacts that you're not aware of that will come out later. So that kind of understanding of the degree of conservation knowledge and media attention to the region could be useful. One final comment on ecosystem services. I know this has been suggested around, I think what Eva has suggested for water risk assessment, I think that's the kind of level of ecosystem service, the kind of spatial scale that could be potentially be useful within IBAT in terms of water risk. But our experience of working with mainly oil and gas and mining clients is that the kinds of ecosystem service risks that are most important at a site to do with local use of natural resources they are so subjective that it would be very difficult to map those on a global data set. First of all, because the level of granularity, the very fine spatial scale at which they operate, and secondly, it's very difficult to predict them, because essentially it's subjectively how local stakeholders are valuing mango trees or water, clear water. So one side, clear water will be extremely important because it's being used for spiritual purposes, another side it's not. So you have to have that interaction between the different types of ecosystem services and how people are using them. And I doubt we're ever going to map that globally. And I think simply that perhaps we need some kind of system where you're fed through. You're pointed out that IBAT isn't there's these other resources which are available to go into that finer spatial scale of analysis for ecosystem services.
And John, let me follow up a bit on how IFC deals with the ecosystem services. First of all, there's the ecosystem. There is the capital, the existing ecosystem services and the flows from that services. So how we're talking about in this discussion and how John just was the flows. So that those that are being used by local communities. And I fully agree with John. It would be impossible, and I really think a waste of time, to try to even map those on any other scale besides for a fine scale and at the site, because as we deal with this is not a biodiversity specialist discussion. This is about social specialists and working with local stakeholders and knowing the processes of doing stakeholder consultation in a meaningful way to get the information out of stakeholders to understand which ecosystem services are important for them. Some of that for regulating services they're not going to know, so that would be more of an environmental specialist. But when it comes to provisioning services and cultural services, it's really all about the stakeholder consultation at the local scale. And again, when I'm speaking about eco-services as a flows, those defined by the users. It's really about stakeholder consultation at the site level. So I don't know how any kind of map would be developed, unless we're talking about just natural capital, which is just potential areas of ecosystem services, of the future, those that are being used and might not necessarily being used at this time.
Thanks, panel. Very interesting. Let's take another question or comment there.
Matthew Barr again from ICN Netherlands. Just a quick response on this issue of ecosystem services. I mean, so you asked the question, what would the companies kind of expect in the future from IBAT? But I would also sort of question, what do local actors, local NGOs, governments could request from IBAT? Because I mean, essentially, what we're trying to address risk for these different groups. What we hear from our local partners in developing countries is, one thing they can influence is national legislation. And so I'm sort of getting back to that point about, okay, what about protected habitats or protected areas that are done in national legislation? So not, of course, you have protected areas, but then one thing local groups can influence is locally protected areas and locally certain protected habitats. So, and that's of course why do local people want to protect these habitats? Because they provide essentially ecosystem services. So that's one sort of way to think about that. We work with a number of large Dutch multinationals in the Netherlands in the Leaves for Nature network, and what we are also increasingly hear is about risk from their dependencies on ecosystems, certain ecosystem types. So at the moment it's a lot about impact, but I think one of the ideas about moving to how IBAT can address the sort of dependency issue of certain sectors on certain ecosystems and how those ecosystems are potentially at risk.
Yes, a tough question, but maybe the panelists would like to give it a stab, or maybe not, I don't know. Conrad?
I'll give it a bash, and actually I'd love to hear Ava or Melissa's points on this too. One thing, and again, probably Martin also, in doing tools like IBAT, we're often getting pressure from users that if it does one thing well, there's an assumption it must do everything else well too. And so it becomes an issue of throwing more and more into the box. And I think the one thing IBAT does well is by not doing everything. It does 2 or 3 things well. It shows you 3 core data sets quickly. Hopefully it explains what data sets are. It doesn't do modeling. It doesn't do projections. It doesn't do ecosystem services. It doesn't do connectivity issues. That may be seen as a weakness, but also a strength. And so, and again, Ava's got this amazing document that lists, it's like 5 pages long, and lists about 25 tools. Okay, so not as much as I thought it was. It's very colorful. But the fact that there's this huge explosion of tools, while on one hand is very confusing, even for someone in the conservation community, is also, I think, partly reflecting the fact that there is a lot of complexity out there in terms of biodiversity services. So I guess just a quick response to the why does IBAT do that is probably because one of IBAT's strengths is it doesn't do that. It's kind of like comparing a library to a car manual. You know, it's probably a very short, boring read, but it gets the job done, versus a much more comprehensive, but then spending hours exploring Shakespeare and other wonderful works. So
let me follow up on that also. I think that's also which person, who are the users? The users that we deal with in the bank and in the IFC, we want to get these concepts across to like investment bankers. You know, frankly, they don't care half the time about this stuff. You know, they just want a really quick answer. So I think it's who you're developing the tool for. It's something like with a high degree of complexity like this might be of great use to planners, you know, or conservation scientists who are assisting planners across the landscape. So I think it depends who your user is. Believe it or not, from my opinion, IBAT couldn't be any more simple. You just click on a couple of boxes and things appear, and yet you have no idea how much I have to explain what this tool does to the users. And some of them aren't even, we have specialists who are like also, you know, they're engineers, they're environmental engineers. They look at waste, water, and air quality and things like that. But we still want them to use IBAT quickly, to do quick screening. And also investment officers, bankers. I want them to use the tool. And I can't even tell you, just clicking a couple of boxes, how difficult it is for them to understand. These aren't stupid people. I mean, they're making multi-million-dollar deals. How difficult it is for me just to get across the point of that's a legally protected area, that's a key biodiversity area, this is an important bird area. Like that's enough of information. So I think we have to keep in mind just how radically different the mindset is of industry and finance. If they're the primary end users of this tool, this is already too much for them to handle sometimes. So I would go for simplicity for this particular user group.
Great comment, but the question pointed out that this isn't our only user group at the moment, and potentially we have got other flavors of IBAT for research and for government. What are we doing about those users? We haven't discussed that much, and that's maybe partly because the investment in producing IBAT has come from the corporate sector so far, so that's what we've had to focus on. But it's a good question to bear in mind for the future. I think I'll let John comment on that if he wishes to.
I had a few. I really wanted to open it again to the floor for those who are the end users here of IBAT, so both the finance sector and the mining sector. Here are 3 suggestions of what IBAT could potentially do, or if it's not IBAT, it could be other tools. One is, some of you will be aware that Rodriguez et al. Are developing a red list system for ecosystems, so analogous to the IUCN red list for species, trying to apply this to ecosystems. The problem is there's no global ecosystem or habitat classification system. Some of you will be aware of that. But at some point down the line, would it be useful, this is a question to industry and the finance sector, to have a global map where ecosystems are categorized as critically endangered, or vulnerable. That's something that could be provided. Second, I see there's a direct response to that. Second thing that could go on IBAT is we often go through this process of offset site selection. So particularly around Performance Standard 6, where there are 3 different stages. First is looking at how big the impacts are, so we do a residual impacts assessment, mapping, putting blocks of infrastructure in GIS on top of biodiversity layers to come up with a kind of maximal residual impact of a proposed project. And then looking in the landscape to see how much slack or latitude there is, how much biodiversity there is in the landscape to provide a biodiversity offset. TNC's developed by design process is doing something very similar. So I wonder if it would be possible to, IBAT provides this set of biodiversity sites. At some point it will produce, it might have other data on it too, such as threatened habitat. But I wonder if it's possible to put things like socioeconomic constraints into these data sets, such as mining concessions. So right now we're reviewing, we're mapping critical habitat in New Caledonia against mining concessions to see how much critical habitat there is inside and outside mining concessions available as biodiversity offsets. So that kind of data is, these kind of constraints are available, and TNC's Developed by Design program is doing that for individual regions around the world. And a third one, finance sector. So why not use IBAT in terms of the species grid and the known sites in the area as a simple way of screening each EIA that comes through. So we are often asked to screen EIAs for biodiversity data, and often they have not realised that they are smack on top of a key biodiversity area because they've only looked at protected areas. And they've often not, and it's also a good gap analysis of impact assessments, because you can see what species should have been found in the area if good surveys have been done, if you know they're in the habitat, because you can see that from the species grid and then link them through to the IUCN Red List habitat preferences for those species. So those are 3 things which I think are either currently possible in IBAT or could be possible in the future. So it'd be great to hear from industry and finance on that. Shelley, I think you had a response at the beginning.
I was just saying, I'd be interested.
Okay.
Yes, please.
There you go.
John, thank you very much. That's lots of food for thought. But suddenly, from having loads of time, we're now coming up towards the end of our session. Just about 10 minutes left. So I would like to wrap up with time to spare rather than running into the next one. If there are some quick responses, that would be great, but then we'll have a final wrap up from the panel very shortly. Do people want to respond to that very quickly? Just 1 or 2 quick remarks.
Just very quickly, I think there is another user group that would be relevant too, and that's civil society and NGOs in terms of doing some of the checking of EIAs and that sort of thing, as well as preparing proposals for governments in terms of protection. So, truthing EIAs is very important.
Good point.
Maybe just very quickly, I think definitely don't want to design a one-stop, and I would encourage you to stick to the 3. And as a once-off, we would certainly use it as a toolkit. I think John mentioned it as, it will define terms of reference, it will focus areas, and certainly exploration. So I would stick to the 3 sites, as long as the data behind the 3 sites is accurate and up to date.
Very good. One last comment from the floor, if anybody has one. Fantastic. We've had a good discussion, lots of great questions, and it's really great everybody's stayed around and contributed to the discussion. I'll ask the panelists, if they wish to contribute some final thoughts, up to 30 seconds each. Who'd like to start?
Very short.
Go for it.
I just wanted to say, actually, I thought it's even better than I thought. I'm happy to participate on this panel. That's it.
I think I kind of said enough just now. I think that's a lot of uses of IBAT. Richard Soleris has brought up this really important point that civil society, now that, so IBAT's now, there's this IBAT for, what's it called? Right.
So research and conservation.
Yeah, some kind of communication exercise to point out that that's a role for civil society in using IBAT to screen EIAs would be great.
Yes, I'm going to follow up with a plea to the IBAT Governance Committee, is that we have 4 important NGOs and groups up there as part of the IBAT Governance Committee, but the ecosystems data is missing. IFC is fortunate enough because we have some information that was given to us from the Nutri Conservancy, and they were generous in doing that. But we do need the ecosystems data, and the IUCN Red List is a long way off, and there are other groups doing that, and I really strongly would encourage the IBAT Governance Committee to take additional measures to collaborate with TNC and WWF to see if we can get tiger priority landscapes in for everybody's version and more ecosystems data into the tool.
Always challenging us this certified conference. No good idea there. 30 seconds, wow. I think the one